In celebration of the upcoming May 4th release of Avengers Infinity War, I recently began a weekly series of reviews for movies set in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Last week, I kicked things off with a review of Iron Man, so let's move on to the next entry in the MCU, The Incredible Hulk. The movie follows Edward Norton as Dr. Robert Bruce Banner, a scientist on the run from General Thaddeus Thunderbolt Ross after an accidental overdose of gamma radiation turned Banner into a savage monster known as the Hulk. While on the run, Banner's attempts to cure himself lead him to reunite with his former love, Elizabeth Ross, while also unintentionally leading to the development of a dangerous enemy more ferocious than the Hulk himself, the Abomination. Alright, so right off the bat, I think we can all agree that this is a seriously underrated movie. I mean, come on, what's not to love about this thing? It's got awesome action scenes with big green monsters punching each other in the face. The redesign of the Abomination is cool and interesting to look at, although I do kind of miss those weird looking ears from the comics. And honestly, I think it perfectly blends the look, the action, all that stuff of the comics with the tone and some of the elements from the 1978 TV show. It's exactly what I hoped I was going to see when I was a kid and my parents first introduced me to the idea of a live action Hulk show. Those hopes were, of course, thrown out the window when I actually sat down to watch some of that show. Seriously though, the overall product ends up being this kind of unique Marvel movie, something we really only get to see pulled off successfully one other time in the first phase of the MCU, something I'll get to in a few more weeks. It's because the Incredible Hulk feels like such a unique piece of the Marvel Cinematic Universe with a decent bit of storytelling potential that I think it's extremely disappointing the rest of the movies don't really acknowledge this one. Sure, we get some references to it both in the movies.
The last time I was in New York, I kind of broke Harlem.
And in the TV shows, but for the most part, this movie doesn't really exist anymore in the overall shared universe. There's really no mention of Betty Ross or Samuel Stearns, barely any mention of the battle in Harlem, and probably worst of all, the end credits scene isn't really explored in any meaningful way, shape, or form. Yeah, we get a one-shot explaining it away, but to me, it's like the Ben Kingsley one-shot we got after Iron Man 3. It just feels a little bit like a cop-out. Overall, the fact that this movie's mostly been ignored kind of waters down the story as a whole, and even parts of the story that actually do get carried over into other movies. I'm sorry, but it's just really hard to care about Bruce or anybody in this movie if the rest of the MCU doesn't, you know what I mean? That having been said, I still like the story we got in The Incredible Hulk. Like, it hits all the important elements of a Hulk story in an entertaining way. We got the fights with the military, the fight with a super tough supervillain, Bruce hanging out with Betty Ross and trying to find a cure, but there are some dumb moments that really only work because somebody's not paying attention, even when they absolutely should. Like, personally, I think it's stupid that nobody noticed Tim Roth's Emil Blonsky had something going on with him after the injection of the super soldier serum. You'd think General Ross would want to keep a close eye on him after the injections, considering he said this earlier.
First sign of any side effect, we stop and you're off team until you straighten out.
At the very least, you'd think he'd be kinda curious about whether or not Blonsky was doing fine when he got his ass handed to him by the Hulk and wound up totally fine not long afterwards. Did Ross just not have anybody on hand he could assign to Blonsky as like a handler or something? Somebody who could report back if the dude started doing anything weird? To be fair, I can't really blame everything on the General because nobody seemed to notice there was anything wrong with Blonsky. You'd think a normally level-headed veteran suddenly rushing into combat and escalating the situation would be like a red flag or something, but no, nobody seems to care about this abnormally aggressive, sickly looking dude just running around extremely sensitive combat zones and beating up random soldiers.
How you feeling, man?
Like a monster.
Seriously, who the hell talks like that while looking like that without making anybody even kinda wonder if he's okay? Probably just as dumb as when Bruce and Betty just immediately assumed the Abomination as one of Ross's experiments.
One of yours?
I guess technically he is, all things considered, but come on. They're watching a Hulk-looking creature wander around Harlem. They just got picked up from the lab of the guy Bruce sent a gamma-mutated blood sample to, and his and Betty's first thought is, oh, Ross, making all these Hulk experiments and just letting them loose on a civilian population for no apparent reason, whatever. What an asshole. Yeah, it's a nitpick, but come on, it's just weird to see a Hulk-like creature immediately get blamed on Ross when it could have been any number of people who had access to Stearns' lab. Regardless of the writing, I gotta give props to everybody for giving some pretty decent performances, especially Ed Norton and Tim Roth. Yeah, I know I talked trash about Blonsky earlier, but Tim Roth really does a great job at making you feel uneasy as you watch his character slowly get crazier as time goes on, and admittedly his Abomination is pretty scary with how ruthless and cold-blooded he is. Like with Obadiah Stane, I wish the Abomination wasn't just a one-off villain, but at least least he's alive and out there somewhere, so there's always a chance we'll see him later on down the line, right? Meanwhile, Ed Norton is great at showing both sides of Bruce's personality, and I'm not just talking about Banner and the Hulk. You really get to feel his desperation when he's trying to stay hidden and trying to find himself a cure. Like, it sometimes really feels like he's out of his element while he's trying to find his way in some random part of the world. At the same time though, we also get to see him kind of thriving while he's out there and surviving. To be honest, Ed Norton's Banner actually seems more resourceful than the Mark Ruffalo version we're introduced to in 2012's The Avengers. Like, there's a part in The Incredible Hulk when we see Banner wake up in Guatemala after hulking out in Brazil, and he's only kinda somewhat fazed by this, quickly getting himself a ride in some new clothes. In comparison, Mark Ruffalo's Banner just seems a lot more unsure of himself as time goes on. Like, it seems like he has more trouble kind of picking himself up after hulking out. Remember in Thor Ragnarok how badly he was pissing his pants after realizing he was on Sakaar? Now, true, waking up on an alien planet might ruffle your feathers a little bit, but I really do get the feeling that this Banner would have gotten over it and moved on a lot faster than this one did. Much like Iron Man before it though, there's really not a whole lot in The Incredible Hulk for the supporting members of the cast to really do much of anything, and that's extremely disappointing, especially for this movie. I mean, for example, in the comics, Betty's a respected scientist, she's traveled with Bruce before while he was on the run. Here, she's really just kind of there, I guess. Same goes for Ty Burrell as Doc Samson. He's really just there as an extended cameo, and is apparently totally cool with his girlfriend hanging out with her ex. I guess he can't really complain about it, seeing as that ex turns into a superhumanly powerful rage monster, but it's a little weird. Speaking of the Hulk, considering how this movie is still part of the MCU, it is a little disappointing / weird that this Hulk feels like a completely different beast than the one we get to see literally the next time we see him. While the Mark Ruffalo version starts off as essentially a big green gorilla who eventually turns into a super strong 5-year-old, the Ed Norton Hulk feels completely savage and mindless, and it's awesome. This dude was scary and definitely wasn't above tearing apart the city if it means taking out the bad guy. Seriously, remember the factory scene at the beginning of the movie? Hulk felt powerful and, dare I say, incredible right off the bat, which really helps someone who hasn't been exposed to this version of the character get him, if that makes sense. And I know I said this earlier, but the movie actually made the Hulk feel kind of scary. Like, none of the other live action incarnations before this movie really made you feel what it'd be like to see that much rage and power, and this one actually pulled it off pretty well. As much as I think Mark Ruffalo's Hulk turned out pretty well, I'm still hoping we get to see a truly savage Hulk moment when he meets up with Thanos in Avengers Infinity War. Moving on to the special effects, I thought they were okay. I mean, they're pretty good. I especially like the battle in Harlem, and I think the Abomination actually looks pretty decent, but it's definitely not as good as I remembered. There's moments when the CGI is noticeably lacking, and it's really awkward. Like I mentioned in my Iron Man review, the Hulk effects haven't really aged well in certain shots, like when he and Betty are hanging out in a cave, for example, but the worst one is easily the part when Banner starts hulking out while he's trying to cure himself, and we actually get to see Ed Norton slowly CGI-ify himself into a savage green monster. Holy hell, that looks terrible, especially when you start to compare it to the amazing special effects we got to see in Iron Man. Now, I know comparing CGI to practical effects is like trying to compare apples and oranges. One's really there in the scene and the other one isn't, blah blah blah, but even the practical effects in The Incredible Hulk kind of feel half-assed. Remember that fight between the military and the Hulk on that college campus? There's a part when we get to see Tim Roth running at superhuman speeds, which already looks a little silly on its own, but then you notice stuff like this and you're able to see it's just a dude getting pulled along the ground and it looks kind of weird. Overall, I like this movie and I think it's a solid addition to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like I said earlier, I think the action's great, the story's solid, but the effects haven't really aged well, and the overall story kind of feels less important when you realize how little of it actually ends up being used throughout Marvel's other properties. It's definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen it already, and fans of the MCU should still have fun popping it in for a rewatch, but it's one of those movies I'd say you really don't have to watch it if you don't want to, especially since the next time you see Bruce Banner, he looks completely different. But anyways guys, that's my take on The Incredible Hulk. If you guys agreed with anything I've said in this review, or maybe you have your own thoughts about something I didn't mention here, then go ahead and let me know in the comments down below. Otherwise, I will see you all next time. Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this video, then go ahead and click that like button, and if you're new, maybe consider clicking that subscribe button too. I've also got links to my Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, Instagram, and Patreon in the description. You should probably check those out too. And if you want to see more of my content, then you can click the link to my last video. It's right there in the middle of your screen. Alright, and I will see you all next time.